Episode 12, The Roman Commonwealth, 120 to 129 AD. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. This time we move into the reign of Hadrian and follow his travels across the empire as he works to unite it with a common ethos. Last time, in 113 AD, the Parthians broke a treaty with the Romans over Armenia that had been in place since Nero. In response, Trajan went east and took Armenia without a fight. Over the next 2 years, Trajan captured the Parthian capital and all of Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf. Then it all fell apart when revolts broke out across the east. The disturbances were caused by the diminished number of soldiers left behind in the provinces, and the solidarity of the Jews with their brethren living in Parthia. The Roman territory was painfully subdued, but the newly conquered lands, though temporarily recovered, soon fell to the Parthians. In 117, Trajan grew ill and died on his way back to Rome. Hadrian was the new emperor, and with him, Mesopotamia was abandoned and Armenia returned to being just a client kingdom. At the end of the last decade, just after becoming emperor, Hadrian had a mess to clean up. Rebellions still rocked much of the east. Hadrian helped ease tensions through carrot and stick. He appeased the Jews by removing Quietus as governor of Judea, Trajan's general who had viciously dealt with the rebellions in Mesopotamia and Judea. On the other hand, Hadrian reassigned soldiers who had been away on Trajan's campaigns. Now back in Roman territory, they were able to finish off resistance. Hadrian next visited the Danube. Just as in the east, disturbances had grown due to the diminished military presence in the area. Many legions had been pulled into Trajan's campaign in Parthia. Reports came in too of trouble in Mauritania. The chaos was growing. Stability wore thin. Hadrian hadn't made this mess, but it was his responsibility to clean it up. Is it any wonder he abandoned Trajan's conquests, after seeing the consequences of stretching the legions so thin? While stationed on the Danube, Hadrian received the news of the deaths of 4 ex-consuls, including Trajan's key general, Quietus. I misspoke last time when I said they were executed without a trial. They had been tried on the accusation that they plotted to overthrow Hadrian. But the trial was a sham. They were tried in absentia. The accused weren't present to defend themselves. So it's no surprise they were found guilty. They were each tracked down and killed. Quietus was in Judea, but without his Berber personal guard. Hadrian had removed them not long before. The emperor claimed ignorance of all this, but the deaths of the chief opponents to his abandoning of the Parthian conquests was too personally convenient for most to believe he wasn't involved. Attianus had been behind these sham trials, and for the removal of 2 senators who were a little too vocal in questioning Hadrian's succession. This Attianus was the Praetorian prefect of Trajan, who, along with Trajan's wife Plotina, had taken Hadrian in at the young age of 10. Hadrian shifted the liability fully on Attianus for the executions. Attianus was forced to resign as Praetorian prefect, but also elevated to senatorial rank and given a pension. He retired in peace. The public and senatorial disapproval for the executions prompted Hadrian to come to Rome. He had just become emperor and he was already off to a rocky start with the Senate. Trying to ease tensions, Hadrian made an oath to never put a senator to death without a vote of the Senate. The Senate liked the sound of that, but remained wary. His abandoning of Trajan's conquests, his succession's murky circumstances, and the execution of the 4 ex-consuls hung over the relationship. Hadrian spent the next couple of years in Rome securing his position. It seems at this time he allowed the abandonment of a large western section of Dacia. Trajan's stone bridge over the Danube, built by Apollodorus, was destroyed, lest it be used by invaders. Rumors began to swirl that he planned a full withdrawal of Dacia. A huge backlash grew, and perhaps because of this reaction, at losing this legacy of Trajan, he held on to the central region with the capital and its lucrative mines. Hadrian quickly set up a bureaucracy capable of running the empire, a bureaucracy loyal to him. But he needed the Senate and the people on his side. He won the public's favor with two simple actions. First, he forgave all the imperial debts from the past 15 years. To spare anyone's doubts, the records of those debts were hauled out into the street and publicly burned. A smash hit. Next, he hosted lavish games, always an easy way to win popularity with the public. The senators were harder to woo. After his purges of the ex-consuls, despite his talk to try to calm their fears, many worried he would be a new Domitian, ruling on his own, cutting the Senate out. To counter this, Hadrian made himself available to visitors from the Senate. He was an open book, and despite his bureaucracy, he treated the Senate with the respect they craved. Once he was sure and stable in his reign, he left the Eternal City, bound not to see it again for 4 years. Few emperors had left Italy for long before. Claudius had briefly gone to Britannia, Domitian had campaigned along the Danube and in Germania, and of course Trajan had left 3 times on campaign. But these excursions were to lead military operations. Only Nero had left Italy for other reasons, competing and performing, and he was widely criticized for abandoning Rome. Part of the reason for his downfall. Hadrian, though, was leaving to tour the provinces for business, not pleasure. He wanted to personally intervene in provincial affairs. This micromanagement was another deviation from his predecessor. We saw last time how Trajan corresponded with the governor, offering advice and help when needed, but generally letting the local officials take care of local problems. Hadrian's approach, though, represented a centralization of imperial authority and action. Somewhat paradoxically, as we'll see this decade and next, Hadrian wanted to shift perspectives in the provinces. His Roman Empire was no longer one where the Romans imposed their rule on the provincials, but one where the provincials were just as integral to the whole as Rome or Italy. All the subjects of the empire, whether Gauls, Berbers, Greeks, or Latins, were to be united in a Roman Commonwealth. Hadrian's personal presence in the provinces provided positive proof of their inclusion. In this Commonwealth, Avignon, or Athens, or Apamea, or Antioch were just as legitimate places for the emperor to be as Rome. For the remainder of this episode, we will be following Hadrian across the empire on his travels. 121. In 121 AD, Hadrian departed from the Eternal City, accompanied by his wife Sabina, by nobles, by a Praetorian cohort, but also by an entourage of engineers, architects, and artists. He sailed from Rome to the port of Massalia, modern Marseille, France, and entered Gaul. As we begin to follow Hadrian, I should mention that our sources for his travels can be murky. We often have to rely on archaeology or engravings for more than would be preferable. Our written sources are brief and dubious in quality. Hadrian's first major stop was Lugdunum, modern Lyon, France. This was the chief city of Gaul and probably the largest city west of Italy in Europe, with a population of around 100,000. We don't know what exactly he did there except bestowing gifts. Tradition says he ordered the renovation of the forum in the city and repaired the theater. He surely visited the sanctuary of the Three Gauls, a temple dedicated to the cult of the emperors. Hadrian didn't stay long, though. His goal was the Rhine frontier. Leaving Gaul, he went north on the Via Agrippa and came to Moguntiacum in Germania Superior. Reaching the frontier, he came to scrutinize the Rhine legions. Hadrian toured the limes, the series of forts and defenses to prevent incursions from the Germans. We've not heard much from the German tribes over the last several decades, but don't worry, they're still there, across the river. We will encounter them again soon. In his inspections of the defenses, Hadrian impressed the legions with his thoroughness. He was not there just for show, but really trying to improve things. And he found the limes inadequate. Expanding on the foundations begun by Domitian, in the elbow of land between the headwaters of the Rhine and the Danube, he ordered construction of the first continuous barrier there. But defenses are nothing without defenders. The discipline of the legions concerned Hadrian. The Rhine legions, unlike their comrades on the Danube, had been relatively inactive for decades. Hadrian instituted severe regulations to maintain discipline. He rooted out luxuries that would make them soft, removing camp dining rooms, porticos, covered arches, and ornamental gardens from their camps. Normally, this would have angered the soldiers, maybe caused a mutiny. But Hadrian humbled them by personally following all of his own regulations. He lived simply in the camp, ate what they ate, and walked everywhere rather than riding on a carriage. Hadrian even carried a full legionary pack on a 20-mile march, an achievement the soldiers didn't associate with soft administrators. He practiced what he preached, and they were impressed by his austere vigor. Hadrian didn't just ask more from the legions, though. He gave, too. He passed policies that raised the legal status of the legionaries, improved their equipment and supplies, and even allowed them more freedoms in their time off, so long as they were ready and disciplined in their duties. 122. The emperor traveled down the Rhine River, crossed the English Channel, and arrived in Britannia in 122. It had been 79 years since the Roman occupation of Britain began, and the same number of years since an emperor had visited. Britain has been absent from our story for the last several decades. 38 years have passed since the governor Agricola's recall. The period between his departure and Hadrian's arrival has left virtually no records in Britain. Last time we were here in the 80s, we saw Agricola push Roman legions north into Caledonia, what we call Scotland. He defeated a Caledonian army and went to the northern tip of the island. For one shining moment, Rome controlled all of Britannia. When Agricola was recalled from his governorship, though, the highlands of Caledonia were abandoned. Archaeology tells us there was a Roman presence in the Scottish lowlands until 105, when this too was abandoned. This pullback was followed by Caledonian raids into Roman-controlled territory from 119 to 121. These disturbances probably inspired Hadrian's visit to Britain. The slow rollback of Roman control and the raids of the recent years got Hadrian thinking about how to defend against invasion. Something to keep the wilds of Caledonia out. He settled on building a wall. We get just one reference to this in our written sources. Hadrian's biographer in the frequently untrustworthy Historia Augusta says, "And so, having reformed the army quite in the manner of a monarch, he set out for Britain, and there he corrected many abuses and was the first to construct a wall 80 miles in length, which was to separate the barbarians from the Romans." Here the source is reliable. In 122, the 3 legions of Britannia came to northern England and began constructing a wall on a narrow stretch of land from the Firth of Solway in the west to the River Tyne in the east. Using 760,000 metric tons of rock, they built a stone wall 3 meters wide and 5 meters high for most of the length. Some of the western section, though, was a smaller turf wall. But even this western section would later have a stone wall added. The plan called for a fort every Roman mile, a mile castle, with 2 smaller towers placed between each mile castle. In practice, the mile castles weren't evenly spaced due to geographic constraints. Hills, cliffs, streams, etc. got in the way. Some had to be placed up to 200 meters off the mile marks. Behind the wall ran a road connecting the forts. About 20 men garrisoned each mile castle. 15 of these mile castles were larger, hosting about 600 men. This network of forts, towers, and garrisons ensured threats could rapidly and proportionally be addressed. After completing its 6 years of construction, 10,000 soldiers garrisoned the wall. Not legionaries, though. They were too valuable to tie up defending a wall. Instead, auxiliary soldiers drawn from the provinces were employed here. The wall was a physical and symbolic border. It didn't just slow raiders. It also controlled trade by forcing travelers and merchants, going in both directions, to pass through monitored gates. As a symbol, the wall advertised to the barbarians Rome's power and dedication to defending its lands. To the Romans on the other side of the wall, it provided a sense of security and loyalty to the emperor who maintained their peace. The bright white, lime-coated wall stood out in stark contrast to the dreary moors on either side, an unmistakable testament to Roman power. In 1782, 2 inscribed stones were found during the renovation of a church in Jarrow, a town in northern England just south of the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall. The stones had engravings in Latin, and it quickly became apparent that they had been taken from the wall for construction of the church during the Anglo-Saxon era. At first, the 2 stones were thought to be independent, but in the 1940s, a researcher worked out that they had come from the same source. Together, they read, "Son of all the deified emperors, the emperors Caesar, Trajan, Hadrian, Augustus, after the necessity of keeping the empire within its limits, had been laid upon him by divine precept, after the barbarians had been dispersed and the province of Britain had been recovered. He added a frontier line between either shore of the ocean for 80 miles. The stones date from the completion of the wall and testify to Hadrian's direction as well as the disturbances that had made the wall necessary. Despite being called Hadrian's Wall today, in the 2nd century it was just called the Velum, the wall. In fact, Hadrian's role in its construction was once entirely forgotten. In a monastery attached to the same church I've just mentioned, in Jarrow, Bede the Venerable once worked. He was an Anglo-Saxon monk born in Jarrow in 672 AD. Among many other works and translations, he wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people. In this book, he begins with the coming of Julius Caesar in 55 BC and passes quickly through the Roman period. When he mentions the wall, which was right outside his monastery, he says this: "The departing Romans, thinking that it might be some help to the Britons, whom they were forced to abandon, constructed a strong stone wall from sea to sea in a straight line between the towns that had been there built for fear of the enemy, where Severus also had formerly built a rampart." So, Bede attributes the wall to a much later time period, probably to the early 5th century. Hadrian's role had been forgotten. But that all lies in the future. Back to the 120s. With his legions at work building, Hadrian crossed back into Gaul in late 122 and went quickly south to the province of Narbonensis, in what's called Provence today. He passed through towns like Avignon, which he made a Roman colony, and Nîmes, which lay on the Via Domitia, the road connecting Italy and Hispania. Hadrian followed this road and spent his winter in Hispania at Tarraco, the capital of Hispania Tarraconensis, which covered most of the north of the peninsula. 123. While in Hispania, Hadrian enjoyed one of his favorite pastimes, hunting. Like his marching with the legions, this is another example of Hadrian's physical vigor. It's likely he went boar hunting and finished off the beasts with a spear. Cassius Dio tells us, he was so skillful in the chase that he once brought down a huge boar with a single blow. And yet he also says in one instance, Hadrian broke his collarbone and came close to being maimed. Supposedly, his fitness saved his life in Tarraco. While walking alone in a garden, a slave rushed at him with a sword. Hadrian managed to dodge the swing and overpower the man. He showed his justice by not condemning the man right there, but by turning him over to the authorities to be put on trial. Hadrian's stay in Tarraco coincided with the 150th anniversary of Octavian taking the title Augustus. Augustus had lived in the city for a year, from 26 to 25 BC, and in his honor, a temple was constructed here. To celebrate Augustus's auspicious anniversary, Hadrian funded restorations to the temple out of his own pocket. At the same time, he sought to further link himself with Augustus by shortening his imperial title to just Hadrianus Augustus. When spring came, Hadrian went south. Perhaps avoiding his hometown of Italica, he came to Gibraltar and crossed with his entourage into the North African province of Mauritania. Here he helped conduct some military operations against the Berber tribes who were raiding Roman towns. The disturbances may have been connected to the reduction of troops during the prior decade, or to the execution of Lucius Quietus, Trajan's general who was a Berber native son of the province. Whatever the cause, Hadrian helped subdue the tribes before returning to the coast and sailing for the east in late 123. He made his way quickly east, but likely stopped briefly in Apollonia, the port city for Cyrene and Cyrenaica. Last decade, this was the city that had suffered extensive damage by the Jewish rebels led by Lucullus. They had intentionally destroyed all signs of pagan idolatry, the many temples, but also the baths and the gymnasiums. And that's not to mention the local pagan population itself, which was nearly annihilated. With the rebellion crushed and nearly all of the Jews forced out of the province, the city sat quietly in ruins. Hadrian ordered the rebuilding of the temples and everything else. Settlers were brought in. Cyrene was restored. Sweeping up the coast of Syria, Hadrian came to Antioch. If you're following Hadrian's travels geographically, moving roughly counterclockwise around the Roman Empire, everything had made sense until he left Mauritania. The logical move would have been to travel east to the province of Africa, then to Cyrenaica, and then to Egypt. What had pulled Hadrian to the opposite corner of the Mediterranean? Reports had reached him of the Parthians mobilizing for war. Hadrian came to Syria to be closer to any action that flared up. 2 legions were sent to the Euphrates to check any Parthian incursion. But whenever possible, Hadrian favored diplomacy. Instead of fighting, both sides came together to renew peace. We're told Hadrian met with the Parthian king, who we assume means Khosroes, still alive and ruling the western half of Parthia, in opposition to his nephew Vologases, who still controlled the east. The Romans and the Parthians took turns dining together on opposite sides of the Euphrates. In exchange for peace, Khosroes asked for his daughter back. She had been held as a captive since Trajan took Ctesiphon almost 10 years earlier. Hadrian agreed and allowed her to return to Parthia. Khosroes also asked for the golden throne of Parthia to be returned. This too had been captured by Trajan. While Hadrian is said to have agreed, the throne never made its way back to Parthia. Khosroes would still be asking for its return from Hadrian's successor. Still, peace held, and Rome and Armenia were left unharassed by Parthian arrows. The Historia Augusta is the only source mentioning this meeting or the tensions at all, so it's unclear if it actually happened. Peace held throughout Hadrian's reign, and something pulled Hadrian from Mauritania to Antioch, so I think it's plausible that there was some kind of meeting, even if Hadrian and/or Khosroes weren't there in person. With peace secured, the emperor went north along the frontier. He inspected the defenses in this remote but vulnerable area, the place where Anatolia, Armenia, and Mesopotamia meet. He followed the military road north, probably stopping at Zugama, the largest frontier town, with a population of up to 70,000 people. It had grown in size and become wealthy thanks to its position facilitating trade between Rome and Parthia. Hadrian kept marching north, inspecting forts and the legions in this region essential to the eastern defenses. The imperial entourage passed over the Pontic Alps until, while descending to the Black Sea, Trapezus came into view. This town would later be called Trebizond, and today it's called Trabzon in northeastern Turkey. Traveling with Hadrian was his friend, the historian and legate of Cappadocia, Arrian, a Greek native of Bithynia. In Trapezus, the emperor tasked Arrian with traveling around the Black Sea and creating a detailed report of his findings. The result of his work was called the Periplus of the Euxine Sea. The Euxine here is the Black Sea. In Arrian's report to Hadrian, he recalls the moment that while crossing the Pontic Alps, the sea came into view. We came in the course of our voyage to Trapezus, a Greek city in a maritime situation, a colony from Sinope, as we were informed by Xenophon, the celebrated historian. We surveyed the Euxine Sea with the greater pleasure as we viewed it from the same spot whence both Xenophon and yourself had formerly observed it. Trapezus sat on a table of land, a mesa with steep ravines on 3 sides and the sea on the final side. Under the Roman peace of the past century and a half, it had flourished as the main port of trade between the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Caucasus. Inspecting the city, Hadrian found its harbor lacking. He ordered renovations and expansions. The emperor and his entourage set sail from here and traveled west along the coast, stopping at the city of Sinope, which lies on a peninsula jutting about 15 miles north into the sea. Continuing west, Hadrian came to Bithynia. Last decade, we heard many of the province's problems from Pliny. Hadrian wintered at Nicomedia and made some excursions to Prusa, Nicaea, Heraclea Pontica, and Claudiopolis. Now, Claudiopolis was not a major town, more known for its cheese and shepherding than any cultural achievements. But Hadrian's visit here, or passing through here, is noteworthy for who he met. Here is where Hadrian met Antinous. This boy, no more than 14 years old, immediately made an impression on Hadrian for his beauty. It's unclear the exact circumstances of their meeting. Antinous may have performed as part of the public festivities that marked Hadrian's arrival, or he may have competed in athletic contests. Either way, Hadrian was smitten by the boy. Antinous was selected and then sent to Rome to receive a proper education. It's not the last time we'll hear from him. An earthquake had struck the region 2 or 3 years earlier, and Hadrian provided funds to rebuild. In Bithynia, Hadrian followed his formula, inspecting the province, giving gifts, granting privileges, founding Roman colonies, and granting citizenship. He must have doled out citizenship generously here, because many locals later added Aelia to their name, this being Hadrian's family name. 124. In spring of 124 AD, Hadrian crossed the Bosporus and came to Thrace. Here the account is garbled. The only action we can be sure of was the refounding of the Greek city of Orestius as Hadrianopolis. During the later Roman period, Hadrianopolis became Adrianople, and it became the chief city of Thrace. When the Ottomans arrived in the 14th century, Adrianople became their capital until the capture of Constantinople. Few pieces of earth have been fought over more than Hadrianopolis. If you were to look up the Battle of Adrianople, your search could turn up any of at least 16 major battles fought here, from the 4th century to the 20th. But in Hadrian's day, during the long Pax Romana, peace reigned. By summer of 124, Hadrian was back in Anatolia. The city of Cyzicus was another place that had suffered destruction in the earthquake of 121. Hadrian was moved by the destruction he encountered. Here he ordered the construction of a huge temple. This temple of Hadrian in Cyzicus was to become the largest classical temple in the ancient world. It had 8 columns on each short side and 15 on each long side. Its footprint was 50 meters wide by 120 meters long. Its columns were in the Corinthian order, that's the leafy-looking one, and each was 21.5 meters tall. The temple was adorned from top to bottom with intricate carvings and rich colors. What god was the temple dedicated to? Hadrian himself. Of course, a temple of this grand would take time to finish. The emperor would be dead before his temple was completed in 139. From here, Hadrian made his way south, through the province of Asia to the Greek cities of Anatolia, Pergamum, Sardis, Smyrna, and Ephesus. As the days began to shorten, the emperor sailed to Rhodes, and then on to the port of Athens. Hadrian was very familiar with Athens, having previously been granted Athenian citizenship. He was even briefly made an archon in 112. He loved Athens, the city of poetry, philosophy, art, and peak Hellenism. He idolized the glorious history and achievements of the city's golden age some 600 years earlier. He saw in Athens a culture which could unify his empire. But the reality of Athens would need to be improved if it was to be emulated across the Mediterranean. So Hadrian got to work. He did much to improve the city, becoming almost a refounder of Athens. Work began on several projects. 2 public fountains, which required an unusually complex series of aqueducts and tunnels, on a bathhouse, and on a grand library sparkling with a gilded roof, alabaster paintings, and a garden in its courtyard. He renovated the Agora and the Theater of Dionysus, where Aristophanes and Sophocles had once held their plays. Most impressive of all was the construction of the Temple of Olympian Zeus. Work on this temple originally began in 550 BC by the tyrant Pisistratus. However, only the platform was completed before the tyrants were overthrown. Work had briefly resumed under the Seleucid king Antiochus in the 160s BC, and then paused again with his death. In 86 BC, Roman forces under Sulla destroyed much of the temple when they besieged and captured Athens during the First Mithridatic War. Hadrian found it in this destroyed condition and ordered its final completion. The temple was big, requiring 4 times as much marble as the nearby Parthenon had used. It would take almost a decade to complete, but Hadrian had done what neither the tyrants nor the heirs to Alexander had managed. Today in Athens, the remains of the temple lie below and just east of the Acropolis. Only 15 of its columns still stand today. Apart from construction, Hadrian was asked to reform the laws of the city. He was invited to revise the Athenian constitution, which he did with care and without getting involved in local squabbles. That autumn, Hadrian was inaugurated into the Eleusinian Mysteries, an ancient, mystical, religious cult of the goddesses Persephone and Demeter, dedicated to secret knowledge of the soul. Hadrian next traveled into the Peloponnese towards Sparta, bestowing gifts to cities along the way. An aqueduct for Argos, restoration of a temple to Poseidon in Mantinea. In Sparta, he invited a magistrate of a noble family to join the Roman Senate. The man agreed, and alongside an Athenian aristocrat, the 2 old rivals, Athens and Sparta, became the first senators from the great cities of Greece to enter the Roman Senate. You have to wonder what the old Romans, if there were any left, thought about the admission of conquered people into Rome's most esteemed society. But that kind of parochial jealousy was an old manner of thinking. Hadrian saw the empire as one not of ethnic Romans ruling conquered people, but an empire of collected peoples sharing a Hellenic culture supervised from Rome. 125 to 127. After 4 years on the road, it was time for Hadrian to return to Rome. In spring, Hadrian set sail from the port of Dyrrhachium, crossed the Adriatic Sea, and stopped in Sicily. We're told the emperor trekked to the top of Mount Etna. There he climbed Mount Etna to see the sunrise, which is many-hued, they say, like the rainbow. Hadrian then finally returned to Rome. I would like to tell you here all about Hadrian's reunion with the Senate, how they and the people welcomed him, and give some detail about his administration. But our sources are incredibly brief on his 2-year stay in the Eternal City. The Historia Augusta tells of him climbing Mount Etna, which I just quoted, and then says, "Thence he returned to Rome, and from there he crossed over to Africa." 2 years are hidden between those words. Here's what can be told. The bureaucracy Hadrian had set in motion during his first years as emperor kept the empire running and flourishing in his absence, without requiring him to be present in the capital. Hadrian made his close friend, the general Turbo, his Praetorian prefect. After crushing the Jewish revolts in Cyrene and Egypt and the Berber revolts in Mauritania, Turbo had proven his competence and loyalty. His appointment was another example, alongside the admittance of the nobles of Sparta and Athens to the Senate, of Hadrian's favor to Greeks like Turbo. They could now reach high positions once closed to them. In 126, Hadrian oversaw the completion of the Pantheon in Rome. Agrippa, the general of Augustus, had originally constructed a pantheon, but this version had burned down in 80 AD. Hadrian rebuilt it on a grand scale, as usual, and added its huge concrete dome. The new pantheon retained an epitaph, and it's this engraving that you'll see today if you visit this exceptionally well-preserved temple from the ancient world. Hadrian seems to have left Rome for a time, even while he stayed in Italy. He visited the Po Valley and Etruria and crossed the Apennines. In what's now the Italian region of Abruzzo, Hadrian ordered the further draining of the Fucine Lake. We talked in detail about Claudius and his freedmen's attempts to drain this lake during the episode on the 50s. Hadrian's improvements further reduced the size of this fetid lake by about 50%. Having toured Italy, the emperor found it much like anywhere else he had been. He then made the misstep of splitting Italy into 4 regions, each with its own governor. This was too far for the residents of Italy, who were proud of their special status. Hadrian's ruling made them no more than a collection of provinces, just like Gaul or Hispania. Hadrian's vision for the empire was not yet shared by all. This division of Italy was quickly scrapped after Hadrian's death. 128. The Historia Augusta tells us, hardly any emperor ever traveled with such speed over so much territory. By the spring of 128, Hadrian was out of Rome and off traveling again. He first sailed south to Sicily, stopping at Syracuse. Then he continued to the province of Africa, in modern Tunisia and Algeria, and came to Carthage. He spent some time in this large city, with a population over 200,000. It was one of the 5 largest cities in the empire. In summer, Hadrian left the city and went with his entourage to a new legionary base called Lambesis. Hadrian arrived in July, which is not when I would have chosen to visit a camp, not far from where the fertile lands of North Africa begin transitioning into the Sahara. But his presence in the heat, without so much as a hat, impressed the legions. He observed them drill on a parade ground, and then addressed the soldiers. His speech was later carved into a column there, and has partially been preserved. Hadrian praises their drill work and commends the soldiers who stood in the front lines, compliments the horsemen for their spear throwing, and makes special mention of the skill and speed of the army engineers. Work others have spread out over several days, you took only 1 day to finish. Hadrian also toured and commented on the auxiliary units which were linked to the legion. Not far south of the camp, work began on a series of walls, similar in function to Hadrian's wall on the opposite side of the Roman Empire. The emperor soon returned back to the more pleasant temperatures of the Mediterranean, and then traveled back to Rome. But his stop was brief, maybe just long enough to pick up a person of importance for the next leg of his journey. In September of 128, Hadrian left Rome again, this time with the object of his affection, Antinous. Perhaps awkwardly, his wife Sabina was also with his entourage. Since their initial meeting in 123, Antinous had been trained in a classical education in Rome. Now about 16 years old, Hadrian found the boy in teenage beauty, only improved by his education. The two had probably reunited when Hadrian returned to Italy in 125, spending time together at Hadrian's villa outside of Rome. The emperor was enamored with the boy, or obsessed. It's hard to adequately convey the infatuation of Hadrian for Antinous. But in events we'll cover next time, I think you'll get a better idea of the depth of his feeling. Hadrian apparently wrote a significant body of erotic poetry, much of it probably focused on Antinous, though all of it's now been lost. If it's not clear by now, their relationship was sexual, though Hadrian was 52 years old in 128. Pederasty, the sexual relationship between an older man and a younger boy, was a practice familiar in classical Greece, though more ambiguous in Rome. Given Hadrian's proclivity for all things Greek, his public emulation of this tradition must have been intentional. Hadrian and Antinous sailed to Corinth and then returned to Athens. The emperor found the city aclatter with construction on his myriad of projects. Whatever you think of the golden age of classical Athens, from a pure scale of buildings and wonder, you have to give the crown to Athens during Hadrian's reign. Never before had it been so beautifully adorned, and above all, unlike during the classical age, it was a city at peace. Hadrian again went down to Sparta. As the other pole of the Greek experience, the vigor and discipline to Athens' culture and philosophy, favor was due to this city as well. Hadrian gave gifts of land to Sparta and offered it the unique privilege of being allowed to import grain from Egypt, formerly reserved for Rome alone. With Athens and Sparta on their way to restoring their dignity after centuries of decay, he began to think over a new union of Greek city-states. Instead of squabbling as they had for millennia, Hadrian wanted to see them united as they had been for just a moment against the Persians in a common league. 129. After attending the Eleusinian Mysteries again and initiating Antinous, the emperor and his entourage left Athens in March of 129. They crossed back to the province of Asia and came to Ephesus, the leading city of trade and Hellenistic culture on the east coast of the Aegean. The imperial entourage didn't stay long. Egypt was Hadrian's next target. But rather than sailing, they took the long road across Anatolia and then down the coast of Syria. We end the decade with Hadrian once again in Antioch, the city where he became emperor 13 years before. Hadrian had passed the majority of those years micromanaging his empire, not from Rome, but from the provinces. His travels, far from dissuading him, had only confirmed his vision for a consolidated empire, sharing a Hellenistic culture, united in a Roman Commonwealth of peoples. Next time, in a more defined episode, we will tie up many loose ends. The conclusion of Hadrian and Antinous' relationship, the fruits of Hadrian's Hellenistic fandom, and the results of trying to push his Hellenism on a people fed up with all things Greek and Roman. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.